So it was at the end of the summer in August. I was scrolling, as so many of us do, on my social media, and I came across this video on Instagram. It completely stopped me in my tracks. It was a compilation by Or Sit, an Israeli videographer, of the past months of the protest for the hostages in Tel Aviv. Woven together, he created this video of clips of people screaming in absolute agony one word. The word was achshav, now. Now, as is generally the case when I'm scrolling through these videos, I actually watched it without any sound at all. My phone was on silent. And though there was no sound coming out, I heard the screams. They pierced right through me. From those eyes of the people captured on the video and that complete desperation behind them. Then I watched it a second time. I turned on the volume, and the screams were barely audible, actually, over the moving song that was playing in the background. But just hearing a little bit, those voices penetrated even more deeply. You know, hearing is one of our most powerful senses. We just felt that just now, hearing the shofar. We think about the power of that sound as it pierces our souls. Indeed, the sound of the shofar, our tradition says, actually travels in two directions. One is between the heavens to the earth, as God calls to us and tells us to wake up from our slumber. And the other is from the earth to the heavens, as we call out to God to pay heed to our innermost longings, our pain and our anguish. It feels to me like this year we are focused more clearly on the latter direction, from here on the scorched earth to the heavens. We release a primal scream of aching, frustration, fear, and distress. I can't remember a time in my life when I have shed so many tears. Thinking back to 1 year ago, the memory that comes back to me most strongly than any other is in those first weeks of October and November, nighttime. After the daily responsibilities of pastoral counseling to so many in our community, rally planning and community updates, after sending my kids to bed with a kiss, it is the memory of crawling into bed and crying. And as the days turn to weeks and months, and the hostages continue to be held captive, and the world ignores or negates the violence of October 7th, and the anti-Semitism rises to levels we have never known, my cries sometimes turn to screams. Now, there are three mothers in our Jewish tradition whose cries and screams have been linked to the sound of the shofar. I think that the cries of these three women have much to teach us this Rosh Hashanah. I know that hearing the shofar this month of Elul has awakened something within me. And hearing about how these women's voices are reflected in the sound of the shofar can provide some direction as we start this new year. So the first mother is Sarah Imenu, our collective Jewish mother to all of us. Her cry is linked to our Torah reading from yesterday, the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of her son Isaac. The sound of her cry in our tradition is related to her place in the story, which, as you may or may not recall, is actually without place in the text at all. The entire narrative of this terrifying moment in which the life of our first Jewish family is put to this test leaves out any mention of Sarah. We don't know whether she is aware of what Abraham is planning to do, if she's worried about the 3-day absence of her son and husband, if she's given any permission to take him in this terrifying test of Abraham's faith. In fact, the very next mention of Sarah in the Torah is in the following chapter of Genesis that says she's died. But lest we wonder what she might have been experiencing in those moments, we do have a midrash from our ancient rabbis that helps us consider her emotions. The rabbis teach us that when Abraham was returning from Mount Moriah, an adversary came to Sarah to tell her what exactly had transpired on that mountain, because, well, he had it in for Abraham. He said to her, "Your husband Abraham, he's taken your son Isaac and slain him and offered him up as a burnt offering on the altar." Sarah began to weep and to cry aloud 3 times, corresponding to the shvarim, the 3 sustained notes of the shofar. And then she released 3 howls, corresponding to the disconnected notes of truah, upon which time her soul fled and she died. Sarah's pain was so intense that our tradition says it led to her death. How do we hear this reflection of pain in our world today? I see it reflected in the voices of the mothers and the fathers and the siblings and the partners, the friends, all of those voices from that video on Instagram. Shema Kolenu, we pray during these holidays. God, hear our voice. Just as you heard and remembered Sarah, hear and give notice to all of the families that are in agony, screaming for their loved ones held in unimaginable circumstances in the dungeons of Gaza. We can do our part by reflecting their screams in the public sphere, especially as attention is moving to the north. The plight of the hostages must remain on our lips and in the ears of all humanity. The second mother that I want to mention this morning is less known than Sarah or many others of our biblical foremothers. We aren't told her name, only that she was the mother of one of the worst enemies of the Jewish people, the mother of the Canaanite commander Sisera. Sisera and his army were preparing to attack the Israelites, but under the leadership of Deborah the prophetess, and with God's help, the Israelites fought and defeated the Canaanites. But Sisera fled, and in one of the most interesting biblical narrative twists, he ends up in the tent of a woman named Yael, who gave him warm milk and a blanket to lull him to sleep before an unfortunate end with a tent peg to the head. Now, this story actually happens twice in the Tanakh, one as a narrative and then as a poem. And in the poem rendition of this, there is a haunting reflection of what Sisera's mother might have been thinking when all this was going on. The verse says, "Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried, 'Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why so late the clatter of his wheels?'" The word used in this verse for crying, vatiyabeb, can also describe the sounds of the shofar. The mother of Sisera became one of the classic sources for the sounding of the shofar, both of the truah and the shvarim. An 11th century rabbi from Tunisia, Rabbeinu Hananel, says that according to an ancient tradition, not only did the mother of Sisera cry, but she cried 100 times. For Rabbeinu Hananel, each and every time the shofar is blasted, we are reminded of her tears. Our rabbis, in their creative brilliance, understood the anguish and pain in the mother's yearning for her son. Though he was one of our fierce enemies who was planning our people's destruction, there is a recognition that his mother is a human being who is mourning her child. Now, if the rabbis of old can find compassion for the mother of a terrible enemy of the Jewish people, how much more can we find compassion for the mothers of the innocent children caught in the crossfire of this devastating war? Having compassion for Palestinian lives, Lebanese lives, is not only a humanitarian duty, but a Jewish one as well. I've been thinking a lot about the cries of the mothers in Gaza this past year. In the words of John Polin, the father of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, Zichrono Livracha, who spoke at the Democratic Convention in Chicago this summer, he said, "In a competition of pain, there are no winners." One of my prayers for entering this new year is to allow my heart to find more room for the cries of all who suffer, not to allow my own pain to choke off my heart's capacity to acknowledge that of another. Maybe some of those shofar blasts that we heard this morning are reflections of the cries of all the mothers in the world. A cacophony of wails reverberates around us, and we all have a duty to allow them to penetrate our hearts. The final mother that I want to introduce you to this morning is even more obscure than Sisera's mother. Like our previous mother, she too has no name. We only come to know her because she is a neighbor of one of the most famous rabbis of the Talmud, Rabban Gamliel. The Talmud teaches, there was an incident involving one woman, the neighbor of Rabban Gamliel, whose son died, and she would cry over his death at night. Rabban Gamliel heard her voice and cried until his eyelashes fell out. The next day, his students noticed that he had been crying, and they removed the woman from the neighborhood so that Rabban Gamliel could sleep. This summer, during my studies at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, I learned this text from one of the remarkable faculty members, Malila Hellner-Eshed. Malila introduced us to a new collection of modern midrashim written by Israeli women called Dirshuni. I loved reading them so much, and as an aside, I would like to teach some of these later this year here at Temple. But one modern midrash that Malila shared with us was a powerful interpretation of Rabban Gamliel's neighbor. It was written by a woman named Liora Ayalon. She's from Kfar Aza, and her son was killed on October 7th. I am astounded that she could write this or anything and to teach us such a profound lesson in the midst of her own personal grief and trauma. Liora seeks to ask the question, why did Rabban Gamliel's students decide to remove the mother from the neighborhood? And this is her midrash. The students sought to remove her out of her neighborhood so that she would stir about in the world, going from one neighborhood to another, crying for her son, and her voice would be like a shofar that sounds from one end of the earth to another, calling out, "Cry, you will cry in the night, for you are the community of Israel." And so Rabban Gamliel will not cry alone for her in the night, but the people of his community and all of the communities will cry along with them and through them, and sorrow will diminish a little in the world. Leora is giving us testimony. She too received comfort in people joining her sorrow. If we allow ourselves to cry as a community, we help to purify our souls. Calling out to each other like echoes in a canyon, we find each other, and in our collective pain, we feel less alone and are comforted. At the end of August, a group of hostage families gathered along the border between Israel and Gaza with a very powerful speaker to scream into Gaza in the hopes that their loved ones in the tunnels would hear their voices. I can still hear Rachel Goldberg screaming the name of her son. Hirsch, Hirsch, it's me, Mama. The sound pierced the air, the kilometers through the tunnels. I would like to believe that the voices made their way through it all to the hearts of their loved ones and gave them strength and comfort. For in many ways, sound can travel much further than any of our other senses, and so we use it to express our heart's ache to the furthest expanses of the universe. Today, on this Rosh Hashanah, we come to shul to hear the resounding call of the shofar, crying out to us, desperate like Sarah, reflecting the pain of this year, the pain of what happened on that Black Shabbat in October, the pain of what continues in the unfathomable darkness between Gaza, now for 363 days. We hear it wailing like Sisra's mother for the devastating loss of life that has engulfed the region and has given us the ability to hear the pain of others. We hear it reverberating like Rabban Gamliel's neighbor, inviting others to share in our pain so we don't feel so alone and so that we can find solace in our connections to one another. We take in the sounds of the shofar and allow them to penetrate our souls so that we might reflect in our own voices that which needs to continue to pour out into the world. May our cries on this Rosh Hashanah have the power to lift up the mercy of God, to open up the hearts of the world, and give birth to something new, we pray, for a better tomorrow. Shana Tova.